Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable discussion. My name is Eric Duncan, and I'm going to lead us off until we turn it over to our extremely talented folks who lead this work in their various fields. We'll allow maybe a minute or two for folks to trickle in, but excited to have you. While we're waiting for folks to join, please let your presence be known. You can utilize the chat and Q&A throughout this entire roundtable discussion, but would love if you use the chat function to say who you are, where you're from, so we can get to know you a little bit better. But again, we'll wait for about a minute or so before we move into the presentation. So thank you again for joining. We have representation from Massachusetts, folks from Latinos for Ed, Kentucky, Los Angeles, Virginia, Bay Area represent, Texas. Well, we have a good cross-section of folks, Arizona, DC, Nevada, which is great, y'all. Oregon, awesome. All right, we'll keep using the chat function, but in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and get started and do some quick framing, and like I said, get out of the way for the real talent here that is going to lead this discussion. Just want to set a little context. Again, my name is Eric Duncan. I work at the Education Trust, and in partnership with Khan Academy, we wanted to hold this timely discussion about educator diversity and talk to some folks who are leading the work to increase the diversity of the workforce in the field, because this issue is pertinent to our current times. And why does this matter so much? Why do we spend a lot of time and resources on this at the Education Trust and with our partners like Khan Academy? Because we have a lack of diversity in our teacher workforce. Close to 50% of American students, public school students, currently identify as students of color, but still over 80% of our teacher workforce identify as white. And we see from the research, and you'll hear a little bit more from some of the folks who are going to share some stuff today, that students benefit from having a diverse workforce, but in particular, students of color benefit from having teachers who share their racial and ethnic background. So like almost every day now, new studies come out that show both the academic benefits of having a same race teacher for teachers of color, but also some of the other areas around school climate, school discipline, that are non-academic, but still contribute to student outcomes that we see that having a same race teacher positively contributes to. So things like suspension rates and discipline referral rates. We see that having a same race teacher can lower those, and it's so important to be in school, as we've seen over the past couple of years, the impact of disruptions on in-person education in school in general, and things like higher graduation rates. We've seen just having one Black teacher for Black boys in elementary school translates to a higher likelihood that that Black student will graduate from high school and graduate from college. So it is extremely important, and always a timely discussion when we are still seeing these data. But I think it's even more important now in year two now. Can't believe it's year two of the pandemic, and what we've seen with teacher shortages and issues across the country with schools and districts trying to provide high quality education and remedy some of the learning loss that happened in unfinished learning during the pandemic. Access is a huge issue, and again, our panelists are going to talk a little bit more about this, but we really like to look at student access to a diverse workforce, and think that even though these numbers, these parity gaps, where you have a lower percentage of teachers of color than students of color, we really think it's an access question. And so, you may even have parity at the state level or at the national level, but if students of color don't attend schools where they're teachers that match their same race, if schools still have racially homogenous teacher workforces, we're still failing students by not providing them the best opportunity. So gaps in representation are wide for all subgroups, but particularly for Latinx students. 25% of students in the United States are identified as Latino, compared to fewer than 10% of teachers. So data really matters in this conversation, and you'll hear more from our practitioners about why it's so important. Want to point you to a resource from the Education Trust that may help inform some of the policy discussions. We came out around a year ago with data and policy scans that I will add a link to in the chat. It's an opportunity for you to compare what your state is doing in investing in educator diversity to other states, find promising practices, see where, if you are trying to formulate an advocacy strategy, where you can invest at the state level in policy changes. So it's a really good resource and tool that I hope that you all can use. And yes, there are some promising states that we definitely want to highlight, states like Oregon, and Darius will talk about Tennessee. But even in those states where there's pretty solid policy conditions, there's a lot of work to be done. And that's why it's so important to have advocates like Darius George and others who are in this space and in the field, ensuring that states are accountable for strategic investments and really stand behind some of their efforts to diversify the workforce. So I encourage you to go to that, and would love your participation real quick in a poll question to give you a little bit of context of what we're talking about from a policy perspective. Take about a minute to answer this question. So which state is pioneering a new way to develop teacher pipelines through an apprenticeship program with the U.S. Department of Labor to establish a permanent grow your own program between select school districts and educator preparation programs? So take about 30 more seconds to answer this question, and then I will turn it over to Sharif El-Mekki to introduce our panel and talk a little bit about his work.
Thank you so much, Eric Duncan. Really appreciate it. Really grateful to be in community with everyone talking about this really important topic. We're often talking about teacher diversity in many different circles, but what I think is really important, and why I was excited to be a part of this conversation, is we can't disconnect teacher diversity to student learning. Sometimes it feels like people are talking about teacher diversity in this abstract way, for beautiful brochures and colorful websites. In essence, if students of color, if Black, Brown, Indigenous students were learning at optimal levels, if their aspirations, their families' goals and aspirations were being met with the current demographics of the teaching profession, we would be talking about teacher diversity in a different context, in a different type of way. But we are talking about the importance of it on student learning, all the research that Eric pointed to around teacher diversity and the impact on student achievement and their learning. And when we think about achievement, it's not only the content that they're learning, but also what is their positive racial identity, which we know there's another whole body of research that speaks to the impact of that in their learning. And so all of this to us is combined and a significant part of what we're looking at. And just really briefly, my name is Sharif El-Mekki. I'm the CEO and founder of the Center for Black Educator Development. We're a national organization really centered on building, or I should say rebuilding, a national Black teacher pipeline that's sustainable, that's highly effective, that's predictable. And that is in 10 to 12 essential cities over the next decade or so. And I came through this pipeline. I was not considering teaching initially. I was considering giving back to my community as a lawyer, because that was a context that I grew up in. But then a Black man in the Philadelphia school district pointed out to me that, hey, the activism that I see in you, El-Mekki, you can do that through leading a classroom. And he says, as a matter of fact, talking about student learning, he said, as a matter of fact, the purest form of activism is teaching Black children well. And to me, that connection started very early on when I started my career. This young man, Terrence Williams, has been a teacher for about a decade now. He's now actually, I will help him tomorrow evening to apply for his assistant principal. So I'm doing a mock interview with him because he is now pursuing the assistant principalship, and he was my 8th grade student. And so again, this is about this pipeline of student learning and so forth. And just really quickly, at the Center for Black Educator Development, we look at the Black teacher pipeline as a 12-year process. Early exposure, clinical experiences in high school, in college, but then also in service, that first 4 years of teaching. And all of that, we look at this 12-year process of developing exposure, experiences as opportunities for people to get involved, be involved, but ultimately impact student learning. Or as early as freshmen in high school, what we're coaching them on, or what's the science of reading, and how can they teach first, second, and third graders basic literacy, positive racial identity development, and some type of project learning. And so that's how we frame it. That's how we are approaching our work. But enough about what I'm doing, because I'm excited for you all to hear from our guests and panelists. So we have Dr. Kristen DeSerbo, we have Dr. Shauna Tucker, we have Dr. Darius George, and we have Dr. Felicia Ortiz Licon. And I'm going to just ask each of them to share a little bit about themselves and why this work is important. And then we'll get into one more round of everyone discussing, but then I'll ask them to go deeply into it. So I'm glad to be around all these doctors. I'm feeling smarter already. Dr. DeSerbo, can you want to get us started, please?
Yeah, thank you for emceeing us today, and thanks to all of you for joining. I'm Kristen DeSerbo. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy, and a big part of my role is looking at education research. And so I'm going to, in a few minutes, talk a little bit more about the research itself and what that is. But I'm here because at the end of the day, it's about empowering students to reach their full potential. And that includes exposing them to qualified teachers who share their background and equipping them with the right tools and resources to help them succeed. And that's all about what we're looking to do and understanding how to do that.
Beautiful, thank you. Dr. Tucker.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to be here with you all. I serve as the Chief Talent Officer at the Connecticut State Department of Education. And one of the reasons that I am here and the message that I try to convey is that within my office, we focus on all of the diversification initiatives within the state around education. And I think we're at a very critical point right now. And I think it is about changing a culture and changing a mindset, not only of that of our students, but of that of our parents as well. And kind of going back and reminding and refreshing and sharing that education is a way to enact change. It is a way that you can also encourage our young people to make a difference, not only in their lives, but in the lives of others along the journey. And it's not just one specific path that you take. That education really is a very wide arena that you may follow once you find what your niche is, and that we should be here to support you in doing so. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the mindset is going to come up a whole lot of times this evening. Dr. Felicia Ortiz Licon, please share with us.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes, everyone. My name is Feliz Licon. Buenas tardes. I'm the Chief Policy and Advocacy Officer at Latinos for Education, and I have been in this field, privileged to work in this field for 25 years. A little bit about our organization. Latinos for Education is a Latina-founded and Latino-led national organization, and we're focused on increasing the representation and amplifying the voice of Latinos within the education sector so we could influence change and achieve educational equity for Latinos. Why is this such a personal topic for me? Well, I went through my entire pre-K-12 schooling experience without ever having a Latino educator. I wanted to be a teacher since the age of 5, and yet only taught for 2 years because of many of the barriers and challenges that educators of color experience. But I'm married to a Latino male teacher, and he's an elementary school teacher serving for 24 years. And so I know that this is a great field, there is great passion in our family for what it is to be in service of others. And we believe that when Latino students have Latino educators and we're able to really match that ethno-racial matching, there's a host of benefits. So we're here to contribute to the conversation, and I'm just honored to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much. And Dr. George, why don't you close us out?
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Good evening and early afternoon. Good afternoon and early evening, depending on where you are. My name is Darius George. I am the founding executive director of the Tennessee Educators of Color Alliance. We're an organization that's focused on supporting educators of color so that they are retained in the space, but more importantly, elevating their voices in ways in which they make systemic changes in the policy landscape. It looks a myriad of ways, but our main three focuses are in policy, practice, and preparation. And the reason why this is so extremely important to me, because my whole entire K-12 experience here in Tennessee, I had one teacher of color. I taught as the only Black man in the building for almost 6 years. And my children, who I'm now blessed to be a father, my oldest are in high school now, and they're trekking the same path that's very similar to the one that I have. And I know that many children across our state are experiencing the same thing, which they don't have access to a reflective and diverse, inclusive educator workforce. It's extremely important that we, someone talked about the mindset shift. We're moving past able and ability. It's about will right now. And so that's why I'm here. We got to will people into making this shift that's so desperately needed in the space.
I appreciate that. And I'm sure our audience recognizes the same way that I did when I first saw this lineup, that they have a lot to expose. Before I ask you all to go a little bit deeper in the work and from the angle that you approach this work, I would love just a quick whip around again about, we often hear about teacher diversity. What do you think the field is getting right? And what are we either missing or getting wrong when we're talking about the issue? So when we hear teacher diversity, what are the things that pop in your mind? Like, we're getting this right as a field. You don't have to go into depth yet about your particular area, because we're going to get into that momentarily. But what are we getting right? What's missing? Big picture still, high level. Darius, you want to kick that back off for us?
Yeah, sure. So I think a couple of things that we're getting right, and I'm going to speak broadly, not broadly, but more specifically in the state of Tennessee. We made some large investments in Grow Your Own work. And so I think people have realized like this DARF that exists between our students of color that exists in our state. We have 40% of our million students are students of color. We have less than 50% of our population in the educated workforce that are teachers of color. And so we've made the shifts in investing in Grow Your Own, millions of dollars. And then in the poll that most of y'all participated in, Tennessee is the first state to be to receive approval to actually have apprenticeships that will allow people to become teachers for free. The areas that I think that we haven't focused on enough, and I used to be a director of recruitment for a educator preparation provider, the National Teacher Residency. We focus a lot on recruitment, and we got to duly put the same energy and retention. We can bring people to the profession, but we're not putting in the system structures and support necessary to keep people there. It doesn't matter. They're going to go. And right now, what we witness in the state of Tennessee, we do okay recruiting, but we lose more people than we recruit. And it's been that way the last 5 years. That's why our gap is widened. The other area that I think, and I'll be quiet, is that I think there's an immense opportunity in educator preparation. We still have not centered racial equity in educator preparation. We have people who are becoming future teachers of color, and we have not prepared them adequately and efficiently for the challenges associated with that. We're doing a lot to try to, unravel those things, but it's not enough. And so some of those things are still going to be in existence when people graduate this spring and take a job somewhere. Someone's going to be just like me, and they're going to be the only person of color in the building. And that's a reality. And there's a lot that's associated with it, if you're Black male or you're Latinx. And so we just got to do a better job in ed prep, and we got to start focusing on retention more.
Kristen, what would you add to that?
That leads right into what I was going to say, actually.
Yeah.
So from the research perspective, we have done a good job, and I'll talk more in a minute, about showing the benefits of having diverse teachers in the classroom. Like, we have those numbers, we have those statistics. We have not done a good enough job at understanding the why teachers leave, in terms of being able to get to that real understanding of what's going on, and being able to understand what kinds of programs and interventions will really help teachers stay and invest. So I think that I totally agree with where we are and what we need.
Nice, nice. And looking forward to hearing more about the, as you dive deeper into the research. Felicia?
Yeah, co-signing to what has been said, I would say that we have this awareness and consensus that there's an urgency to address the lack of representation. I think what we still need to further discuss is how do we build not only hiring and retention practices, but entire systems. And that's practices, policies, attitudes, right? To really institutionalize this effort, we need to make sure that this is sustainable, that the energy around diversifying the educator workforce, that is something that is institutionalized, but that once we recruit them and we have them in our systems, that we validate them, that we affirm and promote our educators of color. And to do that, we need to make sure that we're not, on one hand, passing policies to recruit more educators of color, and on the other hand, we're passing policies that censor and filter them. So we'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. And Shauna?
I would just say that here in Connecticut, one of the things that we've done that is seemingly working very well, and I think the pandemic has helped us, and that is because timing is very critical. We've had a variety of initiatives that we have started, and we have support from our legislature. We have really enhanced and moved forward very quickly, having more conversations around race and bias with districts, really discussing the need for what we're doing. We now have our Grow Your Own model that is in place, but to take it to the next level, we're looking at development of our Connecticut Educator Pathway, which would start at middle school and take you all the way through graduation and into that job within a district. So looking at all of the work that we've done in various pockets, now bringing that all together, moving towards seamless integration. And in doing so, the challenges are we have found some areas that need work, but that's through our collaboration of working with our higher ed partners. And I would agree with my panel members that one of the areas that we really want to focus more on is retention. And so we're doing some things in the retention area, but I think there's a lot more work to be done in that area.
Yeah, appreciate that. Appreciate that. Well, look, let's, and thanks for that grounding about, not only why it's important to you, why you're here, but what the field is getting right, as well as the areas of growth, and some of the areas that we're getting right, as you all mentioned. If we don't get the missed opportunities right, that retention piece, for example, the why around why people are leaving, then it's going to undermine any efforts that we're making. We even see in cities and districts where they have, and Dr. George spoke about this a little bit, when they have increased increased success in recruiting diverse teachers, they also have increased success in higher attrition rates. So we'd love to, Dr. DeSturbo, if you could go a little bit deeper into the research around, like what can make this work, what can we do as a sector and as an ecosystem to really, get this better. And if you can weave in something about research around retention and things that you might have, that would also be great, because we know high turnover impacts student learning.
Absolutely. I'll start off just putting a little more color on some of the research that Eric started out with, just to give the flavor of, again, why this is really important and where things are. So when I talked about getting some of this research right, there are big studies with big populations that have shown the impact of, for instance, to Black students having a Black teacher in the classroom. For example, Seth Gershenson and his colleagues at the National Bureau of Economic Research, which, if you're in education like me, you always think, oh, it's economists, what, are they looking at these things? But they're really good at building statistical models that pull out some of the causal effects that we're looking for. And they looked at the long run impacts of having same race teachers in a couple of different places. So first looking at Tennessee. So Tennessee, as many of you may know, had a student teacher achievement ratio project, a STAR project, that was really about looking at class sizes and student teacher ratios. But they had random assignment. And so it turns out that data set tells us a lot of things about different kinds of things that we might not have expected to be studying but because they had this different assignment, we're able to study lots of things from the data set. So they looked at that and they replicated a lot of the previous findings that Black students who have a Black teacher have higher test scores and fewer absences. But they were really interested in those long run outcomes, graduation from high school and enrollment in college. And they found that Black students who were randomly assigned to a Black teacher in grades K through 3, so really little kids, 9 percentage points more likely to graduate from high school all those years later, that impact all those years later, and 6 percentage points more likely to enroll in college than their peers who in the same school who were not assigned to a Black teacher. So that's a long run impact. That's one teacher who's having that big impact and where those are. So that's really important. Another piece that was interesting is that they did a bunch of analysis to see, is this that the teachers affect the test score and attendance, and the test scores and attendance that impact the graduation enrollment? It is not. So there are lots of other things. This probably doesn't surprise anyone who's in education. Teachers don't just influence the cognitive outcomes for students. They're influencing many other outcomes, such as racial identity, such as how the students see themselves, that are really important for all of those outcomes we're looking for, and that we know that having a same race, same ethnicity teacher can really impact. And so similarly, they found that, so that kind of gives you a flavor of the importance of doing this. And some of that question about, well, why do we see this impact? And so part of that, the reasons that we see this, for instance, we know that there are differences when we think about belongingness. So belongingness is this idea of the sense that you're accepted and included and valued as a member of your community. And so we ask about this on surveys with questions that are like, most students at my school like me the way I am. It's hard for people like me to be accepted at my school. Those kinds of things are questions that we look for when we're studying belongingness. And in a big meta-analysis of 82 studies, we find that this is Korpashek and colleagues found that there's a positive correlation between that school belongingness and academic success, motivation, social and emotional outcomes like self-concept and self-efficacy, your belief that you can achieve the outcomes you want to achieve. So there's all those pieces about belongingness that we see that are really important. And the other piece we see is expectations. And we know that we see that Black teachers have higher expectations of Black students, and those higher expectations translate into then better outcomes for those students. So all those are important things to keep in mind as we look at the research. As we were just talking about, then there's the question about, okay, we know that having these teachers in the classroom is so important. How do we keep them? And here's where, to be honest, we need some more research and understanding. We know that schools with large concentrations of low-income and non-white students who have lower than average achievement scores on national tests tend to have even higher turnover than schools who don't have those characteristics. And so we think about school characteristics. We think about things like salary. So in a salary study, Desiree Carver-Thomas and Linda Darling-Hammond looked at the National Center for Education Statistics Schools and Staffing Survey. And they actually found that Black female teachers were more likely to report salary as a concern than other teachers, even though they actually tended to make similar salaries. But remember, they're teaching in cities that can be more expensive that more often. They also tend to be teaching in those hard to staff schools. So that may be one thing we want to look at, but we also see things like the support staff, the school leadership, things like motivating teachers, articulating visions and goals, developing high performance standards. All of that is valued by teachers. And finally are the things like pipelines and mentorship and having the support of their peers. So all of those are things we start to see that are important for teacher retention and teacher retention for teachers of color. but there's still a lot to do around just evaluation of programs and understanding what's going on for those teachers. So I'll pause there and let other folks discuss.
Appreciate that. Well, you know what, I want to, you mentioned Tennessee, so I want to go to Dr. George. You started TECA, and a lot of your work is based off of your lived experience as a student as well as a professional. So would love for you to, talk about that, talk about some of the partnerships, particularly with Ed Trust, of how that, has come about.
Yep, man, appreciate the transition, and thanks for the question and the prompt. So I was one of those folks, as I was teaching, that was getting pushed down an administrative path, and I did not want to go that direction. So I found my way in some of these fellowships that were ingrained in policy and advocacy. I did not go to policy school. I went to policy school of the hard knocks. And what I realized is that as I got to meet with different legislators and policymakers through these fellowships, I was the only person of color in those spaces. Not to mention, like in the fellowships I participated in, 2 of them, I was the only person of color selected statewide. And so that really, when I realized how the ecosystem of education worked, I realized that our voices were absent. Educated of color voices were not present in those spaces as often as we would like them to be. And so that's what TECA kind of birthed from. And from there, I started that in 2016, which was my last year teaching, 2016-17. And afterwards, I transitioned to the National Teacher Residency as their director of recruitment, with an emphasis on recruiting people of color to be teachers in Middle Tennessee, predominantly Metro Nashville Public Schools. All that to say, while I worked there, I also built up TECA. I'll fast forward. I actually transitioned to lead TECA full time in March 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, which was not by design. All that to say, since we've done that transition, we've been focused on initially that first year on trying to get a educator diversity policy adopted. We had legislation in the state of Tennessee for almost 30 years that required our education state department to produce a policy that would require districts to set goals around how they want to close the gap between the students of color being served and the teachers of color that were serving them. Since 1993, that policy had never been created or adopted. And so we partnered with Ed Trust in Tennessee, and we established an Educator Diversity Advocacy Council. Eric on the call, who talked earlier, knows well about this. We took people that were situated across the region of Tennessee, urban, suburban, rural parts of the state, and all educators of color, and we trained them on the weekend around policy and advocacy and had them advocate to their state board officials on why they needed to adopt this policy. Behind the scenes, TECA was helping the State Department not only draft the policy, but also giving feedback and language around the policy too as well. And so February 2021, we were successful in having that policy unanimously adopted across the state. So that's one big effort of how, empowering educators of color and some of the work that we've done has put people in a position to make some very systemic change. Now, to build on that work, a couple of things that we've done, I believe in localized policy change personally, that's led by the people that's closest to the challenges. And so we launched a fellowship based off my own personal experience again, but also done research, having connected with educators of color and other also white educators who have participated in fellowships. We asked them, like, what would an educator of color fellowship look like, and what's missing that should be added into it? And so we launched our fellowship in 2021-22 academic year in Middle Tennessee as a pilot. That fellowship is focused on empowering educators of color to be the local change agents in their buildings, schools, or districts. And so what are those inequities that pain you? And how do we position you to make change around those things? So one, it allows you to be sustained in the profession. But two, if you were to leave that particular space, can it be change that's sustainable for people coming behind you too as well? We piloted with 12 fellows in Middle Tennessee. We've now grown to 30 statewide, on track to have 45 next year. In addition to that, we've also launched more recently a program in partnership with Teach Plus called the Ascension Project. I personally believe that you have to listen to folks who are centered in these problems to understand contextually what is going on. So the reality of, like, we need more research, more specifically, we need more qualitative research, and it needs to be some specificity associated geographically of where we're doing it at. So what I realize is that we've started district partnerships with 2 of the largest districts in the state of Tennessee, with helping them think through, like, what are the recruitment retention strategies that can help them close this gap between their students of color and teachers of color, and helping them establish their goals. And what we realize is that districts don't have systems in place to tap into their educators of color. And when they do, most of them are reluctant to have conversations because they fear retribution or all of these things that could potentially happen. And so there's a lot of work that can be done there. All that to say, scaling back, we launched the Ascension Project because we talked to candidates of color at prep programs, and they kept telling us we don't have access to professors of color. When we do our clinical experiences, we don't get mentor teachers of color. When we're in these spaces, sometimes it's triggering and trauma to us because we see kids that look like us being done wrong the same way we were. And so there's an opportunity again in ed prep to help them understand like these things absolutely exist, but how do you navigate that? And so we've launched this program because we want future educators of color to be retained. We lose 60% of our educators of color who are early career educators in years 1 to 3 in the state of Tennessee, and probably reflective across the country. So what do we have to do knowing that you may take a job and you may be racially isolated. You may take a job and you're going to see some of these egregious things done both academically and disciplinary wise to students who look like you. How do I prepare you for that reality? That way, when you see it, it doesn't burn you out. That invisible tax of having to constantly combat that doesn't, defray you from the profession. And so again, better preparing our educators of color. But the one thing that we've done is we have a network of 2,000 educators and advocates across the state, and we're leveraging our network to provide every single person in that program a mentor teacher of color in relation to the district that they're supportive of while they're training as a teacher. And so you get access to insight and perspective that can better prepare you for sustainability and retention on the front end before you actually are a teacher. But then you get the relational component of a lived experience from teachers of color who are absolutely giving light to what we're telling them and training them on in that program. There's a myriad of other things that we're focusing on, but obviously those are some of the bigger highlights at the moment. I yield my time.
Well, listen, I'm grateful. Listen, this is really important. You spoke a lot about this specificity, and I want to jump over to Dr. Ortiz Licon, because a lot of times people talking about teacher diversity. And sometimes things may get lost. It's like when you hear BIPOC, there may be some nuance about what Latinx students need, what Indigenous students or potential teachers need, what Black potential teachers need. So I'd love for you to talk about Latinos for Education, as well as collaboration about 1 million teachers of color as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And we actually use the term BILPOC to acknowledge Latinidad in that acronym, though we are also captured in the Black category and Indigenous. We are a very diverse community, as all of you know, and we're a fast growing community. So we have the fastest student population growth. Soon, 1 in every 3 students will be Latino. And so this issue matters to us because nationally, we are about 27% of the student population, and that's nationally, right? We have states in like California where we're 57%, and Texas and New Mexico. But nationally, we're 27%, and only 9% of our teachers identify as Latino. In some regions, that's 5%. And we know that this representation disparity will continue to grow unless we're retaining and recruiting. In 2019, our organization conducted a survey with Latino educators in Massachusetts, and this is 2019. And already we saw that we were losing Latino educators. 4 out of 10 Latino teachers leave the classroom within 4 years. And they do so because they're discouraged by inadequate salaries or microaggressions and biases from colleagues, leadership, or the added obligations that are placed on them because of their racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds, right? So we have Latino educators are asked to translate materials or translate meetings. We know that many of them are disproportionately assigned English learners to their classes because of the perceived idea that they could provide primary language support, or many of them are forced to create materials and curriculum that reflect Latinidad because that's missing in the curriculum. And so Dr. George, you talked about the invisible tax, and our people have coined the term the brown tax, right? There is a brown tax to being a biracial, bicultural, bilingual, biliterate educator. And sometimes there's even a perception because there are many Latinos that don't speak Spanish, yet there is a perception that they should be able to translate or that they are equipped to work with English learners who are acquiring a second language. So this is really personal work for us, and we're really trying to address it via a 2-prong approach. On the program level, We have a Latinx Educator Fellowship, which works with Latinx teachers to give them support and tools as they navigate teaching, but also hoping that they stay in the field and step up as leaders within the role. On the policy side, we are working with a broad coalition in Massachusetts to pass the Educator Diversity Act. And this act is really looking at the entire pipeline and provide solutions to not only get more diverse talent into teaching, but help them grow in the profession. I won't get into all of the provisions. I know that we're gonna, I think, share a one-pager with you post this webinar, but I'll mention some of the high-level provisions. It establishes a pathway for alternative certifications. It establishes an educator diversity data dashboard. We're looking to require uniformity in how hiring and promotions happen across the state, to establish some level of regulations so that we identify and prioritize those districts where there is disproportionality between teachers of color and students of color. We want to elevate the voice of educators via educator diversity councils. And we also want to establish an educator diversity grant fund. So that's happening currently, and hopefully it's tracking well. We hope to have legislation. I also want to mention that we need to focus on other critical junctures of the pipeline. If we are not graduating Latino students from college, we're not getting them to the classroom. So for us, early college, robust high school courses that get our students to and through college, that's critical. Making sure they're interested in the field of education. So we're getting ready to launch a culturally responsive campaign so that our students see themselves in the classroom. You know, Dr. George mentioned that many of the teachers, they see the microaggressions that students of color are encountering. And we had a teacher who said many of her students, in particular Latino males, they don't want to go into teaching because they feel, I'm already disrespected as a Latino male. Can you imagine if I went into teaching, right? And so for me, that breaks my heart, in knowing that our students are seeing themselves already disrespected and sort of stripped of their dignity, right? And for us, it's important that we affirm their worth, their value, uphold their dignity, and say, and you too can contribute to your community, to the field as a professional educator. And then of course, we need to get them hired and retained in districts. And right now we are working with a statewide coalition in Massachusetts. It's a Bill Pod coalition that also includes superintendents. It also includes teacher prep programs and higher ed institutions. And then at the national level, we're working with some of our partners here, the Center for Black Development, Ed Trust, and many others. I won't mention them because I'm sure I'll forget some, but for the 1 Million Teachers of Color coalition, with the goal of recruiting 1 million teachers of color and 30,000 educators of color. We believe that the only way to enact systemic change is really through coalition building. We need to build a movement. We need to make sure that we have expertise, that we have the reach that can only be garnered through coalitions with like-minded organizations.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Tucker, I would love to hear about strategy. What are some of the strategies that you all have implemented? What have you seen, and what are you thinking about implementing to accelerate reaching the goals that you all have laid out?
Sure. I will just say over the past 2 years, we've got a lot going on in Connecticut. We, when I came to this position, we did an assessment. As I said, one of our goals from our state board was diversification of the educator pipeline. So we reached out to our districts to find out, first of all, what are you doing in the areas of grow your own? And what came back was a little of this, a little of that. There was nothing really consistent across the board. So that was one area. Secondly, we reached out to our EPP partners to ask, what education dual credit courses are you offering to high school students? Again, it was very disjointed. Some offered education courses, most did not. They offered other dual credit courses in history, English, and other areas. So based on that, we started working on our plan and said, okay, here's what we need to do. So we partnered with Phi Delta Kappa and brought in Ed Rising as our statewide grow your own model. We started, of course, the year of the pandemic, which was a bit of a challenge. And we started with 8 schools. We're now in year 2. We have 19 schools with more coming on board. with a total of 22 high schools that we're working with. Within the 2-year time frame, we started conversations with the Connecticut State College and University system so that they are aware of our work. And this goes back to developing relationships with key stakeholders that can help you to achieve what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I'll come back to the CSCU system in a moment. But with our Ed Rising schools, we now either have clubs, we have courses that are being embedded freshman and sophomore year. We now have dual credit courses that are being taught. We have, I think, 6 universities that have now stepped up teaching education courses to those students junior and senior year. This year, we have a pilot where we have 2 of our high schools, and we call it our Men Initiative, Male Educator Network, where we specifically have Black and Latino males that are at these 2 high schools that are part of the Men Initiative. We have 11 young men. We have paired each of them with a mentor, again, reaching out to a community partner who's a member of a Black fraternity. He got some of his brothers together, friends, and Latinos who are all educators. So our young men have now been paired with a mentor. Very critical work. We also believe in student voice. We're planning our upcoming increasing the educator diversity pipeline symposium at Quinnipiac University in April. We have our young people who are part of Ed Rising helping us to plan that conference. We want to know what can we do and what resources, what do you want to hear about? And we will help you to plan this conference for all of our students that will attend. Secondly, as we move forward and I talk about our work with the CSCU system, and we engaged in those conversations last fall, our ultimate goal when we develop this pathway that we're in the process of working towards, which is 616 for middle school, because we want to push it down to middle school, not just high school, so that we can develop that pipeline where we're feeding students from middle school into our Ed Rising clubs at high school. But when you graduate, our goal is we want our students to graduate with 9 credit courses in education that will then translate and take them into either the community college pathway or into a 4-year EPP pathway, which we do not have right now. That will be an advantage for many students, especially students of color, because you're walking in the door with a half of a semester underneath your belt. We have discovered that there were some barriers that occurred at higher ed. So that's why we're having those conversations now with our higher ed partner, because what we've got to do is we've got to start breaking down the barriers that are in place to have that seamless transition and make it easier for our students. Also, at the high school level, some of our sites are offering Saturday academies for the students. And in those Saturday academies, they're preparing them to take the Para-Pro because we don't want to leave anybody behind. So you may be a student that may not be able to go to the community college or to a 4-year college full time. You may have to work to assist yourself or your family. But guess what? You pass the Para-Pro, you're going to be hired by district as a paraprofessional. So you can work, you can have benefits, and you can still go to school part-time and still pursue your passion of education. Also, during the pandemic, we developed a program called Next Generation, and Next Gen teachers started in year 1. It was a collaboration with Central Connecticut State University and Bristol Public Schools. And what we did with that program, 20 students who are already enrolled in EPP programs as young as sophomore year, they have been tapped to work 2.5 days in a school district. Not only did it assist with staffing shortages, but the goal is to help them with experiential learning sooner rather than later. Don't wait until year 4 to have to do student teaching. We need to expose you to what's happening in classrooms for you to gain that experience sophomore year. It has been very successful. What we did as a state, and I'll say we started with 20 last year. This year in the fall, we had placed over 75 students in 8 districts. We cannot even keep up with the demand. Those students are getting paid. They're getting paid the sub rate that a sub would make coming into the district. They are assigned an anchor teacher in that district. We at the State Department paid for fingerprinting and background checks for those students, as well as we assigned each of them a mentor. And the mentors that they were assigned were all minority educators. So we partnered with Black, Callis, DNAPSI, and provided mentors to all of those students so that they could have someone else who was in the field who may not look like they looked, but to help them throughout this experience. So Also the work with that Dr. George mentioned, we have put everything in place. We have a residency program. We are also encouraging our districts to utilize their ESSER and their ARP ESSER funds to really grow your own from within your districts. You have non-certified staff people within your districts who would like to go back to school and obtain their certification. You can pay for a portion of that with those funds to assist them and go through our ARC programs that are already in place. Some districts are more aggressive and have been doing that for years. Others are just starting that process. And of course, with the commitment built in that you are to return to that district upon obtaining your certification. There are many other things that I could talk about, but I do want to say that we have worked with our partner, West Ed, for a couple of years, and through legislation, we have produced a guidebook, and our legislation wants every district to have a hiring plan that focuses on diversity. Again, we have some of our districts in the state that have done a great job with this. We have others that are struggling. So we are now about to begin our train the trainer of models, and our reps are going to be pushing out that work to all of our districts. So we're hoping that we can see some resources provided. We have a educator diversity dashboard that has rolled out this year that has the data. Districts will be looking at what they're doing. They can also look to see what others have doing. So hopefully that will serve as a resource for them. There was something else I wanted to mention that slipped my mind, but we've got a lot of things going on here. 616, now that we're trying to put all of the pieces together so that we can have that seamless integration for our students and really attract more students of color. And I did mention earlier about the culture change. We are working with our Teach Connecticut partner and others on how can we change the conversation. How can we remarket and rebrand the field of education? And that includes not only with students, but with parents. Because when parents are not encouraging their students to pursue the field of education, there is a problem. And that's a conversation that needs to be had, and we need to understand why.
Thank you so much. We're, this has been really great. We're hoping that we have a few minutes left for questions. Eric, are you able to pull those up?
Yeah, we've been answering them in real time, but
oh, really? Okay, beautiful.
Yeah, I think there's one question about licensure barriers that folks had a question about. So if folks have any, generally about the practice exam, how folks have dealt with it or addressed that may be helpful context, but we've also been answering questions in real time.
Yeah. I would just say at the center, what we've really been building our model, our teacher academy model, where students learn about teaching, but also if they could take portions of the praxis while they're still in high school, closer to when they're taking particular content. But love to hear how other folks. Dr. Tucker, it looked like you were about to go ahead.
Yes, we've partnered with ETS, so we're offering the free ETS praxis exams for our high school students that are enrolled in our Rising program to help them with ACT and SAT, as well as the content area tests are available to our EPP partners to assist students that are already enrolled in their EPP programs. We are having conversations around praxis. We have a study that's being conducted now to look at multiple measures as to how can you assess someone other than use of the praxis. We are also preparing to expand our reciprocity of certification within the state of Connecticut, moving more south and coming up north. And the third thing, and this is long-term, but we're starting that conversation to work on that, is we are having an assessment done of our regulations, our certification regulations. They date back to 1998. And let me just tell you, it's just layers on top of layers on top of layers. So it's time to start peeling those back and really do an assessment of what we need, what needs to stay and what might be able to be removed at this point to make it easier for people to have access who either want to come to Connecticut as a teacher and also start their careers here.
All right, Reese, I did see, I know we're going to send resources. So one of the things that people are asking for is the bill in Tennessee that was passed. People are asking for that bill.
Yeah, I will post the policy link in the chat here. Let me get it.
Here's one more question. How do you impact the racial climate in pre-K to 12th grade schools? Since that's a big factor in teacher push out, how does your work intersect with the idea of improving the overall climate in these spaces? Anybody want to take that in our last couple of minutes?
Well, I would say that for us, we do that through our leadership fellowship programs, because it is critical to build community, to bring people, cohorts from the same state or across the country, to have those safe spaces where we could have those honest and authentic conversations, right? And sometimes that doesn't necessarily change that culture or that climate that you're in, but it gives you an outlet and it gives you a support and it gives you a cohort of like-minded individuals so that you could better navigate those systems.
All right. We only have, I have one quick whip around I would love everyone to respond to. If we were to reconvene in 5 years, this panel, this audience, what do you hope we'd be able to say we did during this time? Just give me one sentence. Dr. DeSerbo, you want to start us off?
We have solid research that tells us why teachers stay and why they leave.
Dr. Tucker?
I'd like to see a plan in place that would yield at least 3,000 educators of color that would be in the pipeline and in the system working. That's
Dr.
sustainable.
Ortiz, oh, sorry. That's sustainable, you were about to say?
Yes.
Absolutely. Dr. Ortiz Licon?
And we're going to do that. We're going to celebrate that the 1 million teachers of color are halfway in meeting their goal.
Dr. George?
We created some sustainable measures in place to be able to keep folks who are in prep programs right now in prep programs and not exited due to the barriers that sometimes exclude them at the very inception of them starting.
Absolutely. One of the things I'm hoping is that we have far more high school, middle school youth as well who can envision themselves leading a classroom based off their experiences that they're having as students with not only teachers of color, but others who are culturally proficient and consistently so. We have 1 minute. I don't know if we have time for the poll results, Eric. Like a 30-second snapshot of the poll results.
It should be up now.
Yep, it is. Thank you. I hope everybody can see that. All right, so all of us and you know, we have, and I can just tell you in Pennsylvania, we have much that we can learn from all 4 of your states that we have listed here, and looking forward to continuing the collaboration with your organizations. I just want to, you know, thank the sponsors of this panel, the audience, and particularly the panelists for coming together and sharing the expertise from different, you know, different vantage points. You know, too often people take complex issues and try to create, you know, really simplified solutions when we know that there are multiple reasons, logistically, culturally, policy-wise, that need to be addressed in order to elevate the teacher profession, to diversify the teacher profession, and ensure that we're accelerating our students' learning. So I want to just say, you know, thank you all for your time. Thank you for your contribution in this space, as well as all the other spaces that your work is impacting. And again, thank you all for joining us for this panel. Thanks again. Appreciate you all.
Thank you. Thank you all. Great meeting you.
Have a good one.
Take care.